The main point is that we have this container element, so we have our div, and what we generally want to do is use that to provide most of the styling for the content in that div. So we're going to open up this style attribute, and then we'll set things like, you can set the color. I like using high contrast stuff, so just use black. It's default anyways, but we can set it there. And then things like font family, font size, so we'll make these sans serif. I expect some of you will have questions about using web fonts in email, which we can definitely dig into. There's definitely a few gotchas about doing it. But we'll make sure our text is big enough so people can read it. Good thing is to keep in mind that we want to have a generous line height, just so people can read things a little bit more clearly. We don't want it to get too big and make it hard to read. But especially in email, when so much relies on links, you're trying to get people out of your email and take some sort of other action. If you have those text links in a block of copy, you can create those link clusters and really closely packed links, and people will try to tap it and they'll go where they don't want to go. So line height's probably the best way to make sure you have enough breathing space for all those links and those blocks of copy. So here we generally want to use, again, pixel units instead of relative units, like just that 1.4, or use like ems or something like that. Just because a lot of email clients they haven't been updated in a long time, so they might not recognize or know how to render those relative units. So for the most part, all of our units in our emails are going to be pixel sizing, which is a little bit weird. There's formulas for kind of converting those, relative to fixed units if you need them, but I usually just give it plenty of space, maybe double whatever the pixel size happens to be, or a little less than that. When you start doing things like headings, like longer lines of headings, then you might want to shrink that down a little bit so that the text sits a little bit closer and is easy to read. So let's look at that and see what it's look like here. So better, we don't have that outdated like Times New Roman style serif that nobody likes in, pretty much outside of print books these days. Nothing too fancy. We can see that we haven't really done anything to the heading here. So we get this default styling, which is just bold, a little bit bigger than our normal text size, but we can update that too. So we have our default universal styles that apply wholesale to any of that content in there. When it comes to block level elements, the main thing we're going to be doing is overriding any of those margins or the padding on those elements. So for headings especially, we want to make sure that we control those margins. We don't leave it to the browser or the email client to do that. So I usually zero this out to start out with, and then introduce more padding or more margins as needed. The same thing applies for paragraphs, so we can add a style in there. Add this margin, set it to 0 for now. And this becomes especially important as we start to add up more copies. So let's copy that and add another paragraph down here. And you can see we don't really have any space between that. So that's where we start using those inline styles to add that additional space. But we want to control that. We don't want to leave it up to the browser or the email client to set that for us. So for the heading, let's add a little bit of space on the top and bottom. Let's say, since heading will maybe add 40 pixels and 0. You can use shorthand. Most email clients will respect that shorthand. You don't have to declare margin top, margin bottom, margin left, margin right, unless you want different settings for those elements or for that spacing. So plenty of space around the heading. And then, for the most part, for paragraphs, as I start training them, I just add the margin to the bottom of that paragraph instead of the top. Will just help keep things nice and consistent as we start adding more content in here. So we can do, it goes top, right, bottom, left for that shorthand property for margin. So we can do 0 for top, 0 for right, but maybe add 20 pixels on the bottom, and then 0 for the left. So I just copy that style down here. Then we have a little bit of space. We have plenty of line height, maybe even a little bit too much. We can take that down some, say like 28. That's a little bit better, a little bit more comfortable. Obviously, we aren't doing anything structural to the email, but we can see how that might work with our container div here. So all of these styles control the text in our email, but if we want to start structuring things a little bit more, we can get started by using the max width property. This doesn't, we're again not using tables yet. We'll see how that comes into play a little bit later on. But this is kind of part of the basis of that hybrid coding approach, which we'll look at. But max width is super helpful. We can make it, something like 600 pixels. That'll constrain it. You can see that our image is still blowing out of that container because it's so large. We're using this retina image, but we'll look at how to constrain that when we start digging more into images themselves. Similar on the web, right now we're going to use margins to center that content. So we'll do the old zero auto trick. And then we're centering that content, which is cool. One thing I want to do is resize this logo. So if that was my logo, it'd be gigantic, and I don't want that to happen. So I am going to add a width attribute here and set it to say, let's say 60 pixels. Let's see what that is. So that's a little bit better. I want to style that a little bit too and add a border radius to make it circular. So I'll just set it to whatever that width happens to be. That's cool. So one thing to note though is that as you start using a little bit more advanced CSS, like things that were introduced in CSS 3, things like border radius, this isn't supported across all email clients. And when we start getting into things like centering these images, that doesn't work across clients as well. So let's center, let's say call this display black, margin, zero auto. So we're centering that in the email. I think I want to center the heading as well. So again, we can just use text align, center on our heading tag. That's not something we want to set at this universal kind of container level because we don't want all of this copy down here to be centered. That definitely has very big accessibility implications, which we'll look at in a minute. But we'll just set that on the heading itself. So we have that centered heading, looks nice. We have the body of the email down here. If we want to style that footer text a little bit differently, a common practice is to make it a little bit smaller than the main copy, and then make it lighter colored. So instead of black, we could make it gray, and then maybe make it 14 or 16 pixels, decrease the line height a little bit to match. And you can see that we have this footer copy down here that's a little bit different. We can add in here a little bit more spacing to our email, or to this footer section. So we'll use margin again. Let's say 60 pixels up top. Put in a little space below. And then down below too, we can add a little bit extra space on the bottom there. So now we have a little bit of spacing between our footer and the rest of our content, which will help separate it. But pretty basic stuff. We're just using those tried and true, well-tested CSS properties. We're adding a little bit of structure using this max width and the margin. We don't need that since that's contained in this overarching div. And just making things look a little bit nicer. So let's see what something like this actually looks like when we look at it in real clients. So this is again using that Limis extension, which will load, depending on the speed of the internet here, load our email in all these different email clients. Right now I'm just testing in 35 popular clients. Right now we have 87 available. It's usually closer to 100, but sometimes some of the machines are down, or we have issues with some of the clients, so we'll pull them down. So you can see a couple of things here. For things like Apple Mail, which works there, which has like really good support for HTML and CSS. You can see that all of this works. Our image is still blowing out here. We'll make that a responsive in a minute. But all of this copy works. Our image has that border radius applied and it's centered. But when we get into things like Outlook, you can see that a lot of that doesn't work. The border radius doesn't work. Centering that image by making it block level and using margins doesn't work. And then that max width doesn't work, which is a huge issue for us because we do have a lot of people still using Outlook clients. So that's where things like tables or hybrid coding will come into place to provide better, more robust structure for those emails. You can just kind of flip through and see how it renders. Again, the outlooks are not pretty at all. But when we get into things like Outlook 2019, which happens to be on Mac, that uses WebKit again as a rendering engine, which is awesome. It works really well. The Apple Mails are awesome. Old versions of Android are actually really good. Newer versions, not so much. The Gmail app, depending on how you're using it, tends to be a pretty solid rendering engine. Surprisingly, there's a lot of different versions of Gmail out in the wild. So there's a great article by a guy named Remy Parmentier, who is a French email developer, and he mapped out all the different versions of Gmail. So there's not just like consumer Gmail, but there's G Suite, there's Google Apps, there's whether or not you're using it in the app or via IMAP, it does different things to your code. So it's definitely something to dig a little bit into and try to understand. But for the most part, the Gmail app is pretty solid. You get into the IMAP rendering. Sometimes you run into some issues there. The Outlooks are good. Samsung is its entire own world. Has a lot of different problems with email rendering, so it's usually pretty tricky to get things working well in Samsung Mail. But we'll look at using tables and hybrid coding to account for some of those problems. Gmail app, Outlook. But it's nice you can go through and see exactly how your email renders across these different email clients. So a nice trick to account for things like that centering in Outlook is to rely on a good old tag that nobody uses anymore, which is center. So this is completely deprecated, but we can use it in the context of email to make that work in Outlook. So if we save that, we can rerun Litmus here. Hopefully Outlook will pop up soon. So you can see we do get that centering. So depending on what you need to do, that's really common for like logos, different images like icons and stuff like that. You can use that deprecated HTML. It's pretty commonplace in email development to make Outlook handle some of our styling a little bit better.
All right, we did have a question in chat.
Sure.
What about border? Should it be used or not on block level elements?
So border you totally can use. It's pretty reliable. So the way you do that is just using that border shorthand. So set your width, your what type of border that is, whether it's solid, dash, dotted, whatever, and then the color of the border. Padding, again, is pretty well supported across block level elements. So those are used together a lot of times to create like buttons or like a grid type element or like a card type element. You'll have that border on there with padding around that element. So yeah, go for border. It works well. And usually combine that with padding to get cool effects like buttons, which we'll look at.